The conversation between Nahida and Dottore still remains to this day my absolute favorite cutscene in the game. You went through all the drama of fighting Scaramouche, curing Irminsul, and you thought you finally achieved a happy ending. Everything was perfect. Everything was going so well. It felt like we got everything we wanted. And then, the doctors showed up at the last second, proving that in the end, they were still the ones in control. And so, the Fatui walk away with the Gnoses once more. This scene in particular was probably the most powerful one out of the 4 Archon quests. For me, this just further cemented Sumeru Act 5 as the greatest Archon quest, or at least my favorite. But there's lots to unpack with this cutscene. As you know, it was a psychological battle between 2 of Sumeru's greatest minds. And there's lots of hidden meanings behind the dialogue that you may not have thought of at the time. So let's break it down. It all begins with the emotional leftover of Greater Lord Rukkhadevata, where the Traveler, in all of their main character grandeur, was completely immune to the memory erasure. The story really shows us how special the main character is. They undoubtedly shine the brightest in this nation. That's what makes the opening scene so powerful. Just like that, we were instantly defeated by Dottore. The fact he so easily dispatched the Traveler completely breaks any sense of confidence and safety the story may have had. It was all planned. Despite everything we did, we were still helpless in the end. This is even reinforced by the fact that Dottore didn't take us seriously enough as a threat to help Scaramouche. He thought there was far more to gain by allowing the situation to play out, and that in itself shows. We were lucky that Dottore chose not to do anything. After knocking us out and having Nahida all to himself, he revealed that he had multiple segments. This was foreshadowed for a while in the Harbinger trailer along other sources, but some of you know already, I won't get into that here. What I'm more interested in is the conflicting philosophy behind those segments. Dottore believes it to be a brilliant innovation to surpass human limits, while Nahida finds it an insult to life, rejecting it entirely.
It's an insult to the very concept of life.
Dottore remarks that it's disappointing that even the god of wisdom is limited by cognition. The inference is that deep down, Dottore believes his ideals as superior to Nahida's. He's not chained down by arbitrary rules, and the fact that Nahida hasn't thought of this and only uses vague arguments like,
Life inherently has many rules and restrictions, each with its own significance and reason to exist. They can't be broken on a whim.
isn't a point that will convince him of anything. While she may have a perfect counterpoint in her own mind about why it's wrong to create segments, and how awful it is in the face of nature, Dottore here presents a compelling argument while Nahida lacks a real counterpoint.
Even the same individual will have different cognitions at different ages. A long time ago, I made a major decision in hopes of preserving all my perspectives of how I observed the world. So I saved segments of all my ages and made them into independent individuals.
If I were to view this as a debate, Dottore actually wins this one. But as that topic comes to a close, the next one was about the experiment to create a new god. Nahida was baffled by the fact that this was just an ordinary experiment for him. She also believes this could cause trouble with the Tsaritsa.
You really are crazy. If the experiment succeeded, you would have had a new god on your hands. How would you have faced your own god then?
It must seem like blasphemy for Dottore to create a god as the servant of another god. And Dottore says this in response.
I'm first and foremost a scholar. These results should be left to the judgment of the hypothetical me confronted with that outcome. But you're right. And that's exactly why I'm disappointed with the conclusion of this experiment.
I'm going to speculate here, because this was a pretty confusing line. He talks about Nahida's point being exactly why he's disappointed with the conclusion of the experiment. It's unclear what he means by this, and he doesn't elaborate further. The best I can make of it is that he was disappointed that Scaramouche didn't turn out as successful of a god as he'd hoped. The Fatui Harbingers, in all likelihood, knows about the experiment. He openly talked to Capitano about it in the trailer.
But Dottore, what of Scaramouche and the Gnosis from Inazuma?
Conventional wisdom holds that divine knowledge cannot be rationally comprehended. After conquering the divine gaze, he will make his next move.
So it seems the plan was for Scaramouche to become a new god, conquer the divine gaze, and make a move on his own. The Fatui did not at all seem concerned about Scaramouche becoming a god, and I highly doubt this is blind trust. They'd have to recognize that Scaramouche values the Electro-Gnosis as his own. There was no chance he'd surrender it to the Tsaritsa. This is supported by his attitude towards Dottore in the Hypatia cutscene.
The Doctor has never known his place. Even now, the puny human thinks himself capable of interfering in the business of the new god.
So as for the nature of the experiment itself, Dottore says he wouldn't interfere as it was just an experiment, but Nahida believes him crazy to risk everything for that. But again, none of the other Harbingers were concerned at all. They trusted the plan would work out in the end. What I think is going on here is that Dottore is just hiding the true nature of the experiment to Nahida. There was no need to tell her why it was conducted. But I have a good answer for why it was done. First off, it's a Gnosis. The Fatui is planning to collect all 7 Gnoses for the Tsaritsa, and Scaramouche was meant to inherit the Gnosis to become the next Electro Archon. In the eyes of the Fatui, this should have been a golden opportunity to test the Electro Gnosis. Dottore says that Nahida can't use it in battle.
Lesser Lord Kusanali, you're an intelligent Archon. You have no way to use that Electro-Gnosis in battle.
Proving that there's at least some criteria for this. Only specific people, under specific conditions, could use the Gnosis, and there should be no better opportunity than to test it on the best available host, the vessel that was born to use it in Scaramouche. Another goal of the experiment is that, as established earlier, Scaramouche is emotionally invested and very possessive of his Gnosis.
Please! Anything but the Gnosis!
By setting him off in Sumeru and having him face the Doctor, the Fatui could conveniently take the Electro-Gnosis away from Scaramouche without having to directly confront him. It would just be one of those typical treacheries that the Fatui is known for. Why would the Harbingers go through the trouble of fighting Scaramouche for a Gnosis when the Traveler could just do the dirty work for them? So, I believe that the most disappointing thing about the experiment was that he couldn't get more results. The stronger Scaramouche would have been as a god, the more confidence the Fatui would have in the power of the Gnosis. And while I don't know how Dottore would respond if Scaramouche defeated the Traveler, became Sumeru's new god, and defected, all the evidence seems to point to them not really being concerned at all. There's also the factor of the unconsumed forbidden knowledge, which I have little to go off of. There could be a sub-goal of the experiment to see if this artificial god could resist the forbidden knowledge better than Greater Lord Rukkhadevata. But yeah, this ordinary experiment rhetoric was only said by Nahida. For Dottore, this experiment was likely more important than she thinks. Next is perhaps the most juicy part, the destruction of the Gnosis.
What if I were to destroy the Gnosis now and awaken the heavenly principles?
Awaken the heavenly principles?
It's later revealed that Dottore had no idea whether it was true or not, but he didn't want to call Nahida's bluff and risk awakening the heavenly principles. In hindsight, this makes the point of experimenting on Scaramouche even stronger, because it reveals they don't know everything about the Gnosis, and any opportunity to learn more and gather data on it is much welcome. There's way too much unknown in the story to determine what exactly would happen if the Gnosis was destroyed, so I won't try to tackle this beast. This was to gain leverage over Dottore due to her standing no chance in a fight, which was some pretty clever thinking on her part. Nahida demands Dottore erase all his other segments, which, when you look at her earlier reaction about it being an insult to life, this was probably personal. She likely felt pretty offended when she heard about this, and now she wants to purge these violations. At least that's my headcanon. But it also happens to be the biggest blow you can deal to him, so that line of thinking also works. Later, Dottore says this one particular line.
Among all the versions of me, this segment you see now is the most selfish. If it weren't me, your idea wouldn't have worked.
This is a loaded statement, because it implies two major truths about Dottore. First off, this implies that all segments technically have the power to erase all the other segments, because he's implying the others won't do it out of selflessness. Of course, he could be hiding the existence of some hierarchy within the segments themselves, but I think that causes too much friction considering they don't get along as is. This actually means, despite all the alleged squabbling and arguing, the segments get along surprisingly well enough to not want to kill each other. That is quite impressive when the implication is that one segment could simply erase all the others with zero repercussions. Second, the implication from our idea not working was quite telling for another reason. He doesn't feel particularly cornered by this decision. Like, if Nahida was going to play hardball and demand nothing less than the complete erasure of all other segments, then how would the plan not work with a selfless segment? If that was the only deal Nahida was willing to accept, then it would work regardless of one's selfishness. If Nahida's plan were to fail, wouldn't Dottore also fail for failing to strike a deal for the Gnosis? The only logical conclusion was that he had other ways to get it done, and this was after the threat of awakening the heavenly principles. Later on, he ultimately agrees. You can make a lot of inferences through this scene, but I attribute it to a few factors. One, he's doing it for the Gnosis. And as a Fatui Harbinger, he's really showing his loyalty by making that big of a sacrifice, which further strengthens the point that the Scaramouche experiment wasn't at the expense of the Tsaritsa like Nahida believed. 2. If all the segments really had the ability to erase every other, then this would be the perfect excuse to get rid of them. After all, you never know if one of the other segments will do the exact same thing. This Dottore is selfish, and here was a golden opportunity to erase the threat from the other segments. Of course, at the end, Dottore trades secrets in exchange for the Dendrognosis, and that concludes the cutscene. Of course, that's technically not all that happened. We hear a little more by asking Nahida ourselves. First off is a small detail. She considers, in hindsight for Dottore's reveals to be, quote, a boon of new knowledge I couldn't refuse, which means she wasn't disappointed with what she got, and she highly values the new knowledge she received. Second, there was the bombshell revelation about the Descenders. Super elaborate theories aside, I instead will highlight the Fatui keeping records on these things. They are undoubtedly interested in the Descenders. Question is, how did they confirm that the Traveler was a Descender? We can't cite the use of multiple elements because our twin can likely do the same thing. Based on what we know, the Fatui would have to check the Irminsul themselves. But even if they had access, it still takes time. Scaramouche knew what to look for, the Abyss Twin Conria 500 years ago, and it still took him time to find something. I imagine scanning for a lack of information on the Traveler would take much, much longer, because you'd have to secure every piece of information and not find it. Which means there has to be something else, at least. And of course, whatever means they are, the Fatui have likely been closely monitoring the Traveler this whole time. And the point I'm getting at here is that the Fatui are, by extension, highly interested in the Traveler because of their confirmed intel on the Descenders, even further amplified by the Heavenly Principles being the first. It's in their best interests to learn the nature of the enemy they desire to overthrow. So as I mentioned in an earlier video, this probably goes a long way to explaining why the Fatui always constantly neglects to kill the Traveler, and no order was ever issued by the Harbingers to eliminate them either. All in all, looking deeper actually reveals a lot about what happened in the Sumeru stories. Certain things just make more sense, and I even learned a lot myself while I was making this video. What I basically take away from this is that Dottore is far more cunning and clever than we even thought initially. He manipulated the crisis at Sumeru in a way where he technically couldn't lose. In the end, everything that happened, even the erasure of the segments, still benefited him in some way. Consider it one silver lining in a pile of victories in Sumeru. So that's all I have for the breakdown. This was a really long one. I hope you got some valuable takeaways from this, and let me know if there's other stuff you want to share about what we've discussed. And as always, see you all next time.